By late 1944, Japan faced a hard truth. It could no longer fight the United States in daylight. American fighters dominated the skies, and every daytime raid toward the Philippines ended in heavy losses. So, Japanese planners shifted to the one window the Americans still struggled to defend, the night. Not to win air superiority, but to delay the U.S. advance where it mattered most. On small islands south of Luzon, American engineers were racing to finish new airfields that would support the upcoming Lingayen Gulf landings. If those runways became operational on time, U.S. fighters could shield the entire invasion force. If they were delayed, the campaign's timetable and thousands of lives would be at risk. Japan understood this perfectly. Night bombing became a strategic tool. Hit the construction sites, scatter the crews, crater the runways, and force the Americans to fight on a slower schedule. For 2 straight weeks, Mindoro Island endured near constant raids. Searchlights and anti-aircraft guns could do little, radar coverage was thin, and the engineers worked knowing that darkness invited another attack. Everything depended on stopping Japan's night strategy. That chance arrived on December 29th, when a P-61 Black Widow, armed with a radar system the Japanese didn't know existed, climbed into the sky with Major Carroll C. Smith at the controls. Before dawn, the calculus of the night war would change. The trouble wasn't that the United States lacked aircraft. By 1944, America was producing fighters and bombers at a scale no other nation could match. The problem was that almost none of those aircraft were designed to operate where Japan had shifted the fight inside the darkness itself. Early in the war, the U.S. tried to improvise night fighting capability by modifying existing day fighters. P-70 Havocs, P-40s, even P-38s were fitted with experimental radar sets and sent into service. On paper, these conversions offered a quick solution. In combat, they revealed serious limitations. Their radars were unreliable. Their cockpits weren't arranged for night interception. And their performance dropped sharply when burdened with heavy, early-generation radar equipment. Crews struggled with the basics: finding targets, maintaining visual contact, and coordinating with ground control in terrain where radar coverage was incomplete. A night raid could pass within a mile of a patrolling American aircraft and never be seen. At the same time, Japan was attacking precisely where these weaknesses mattered most. The U.S. needed an aircraft that wasn't simply a day fighter with a radar bolted in. It needed a platform built from the ground up to locate, pursue, and destroy bombers in total darkness. That meant 3 requirements: a radar powerful enough to detect aircraft miles away, a stable, long-endurance airframe, heavy forward-firing armament. Night fighting was no longer a niche mission. It had become a strategic necessity, especially as Japan shifted its efforts toward halting U.S. engineering units and undermining the momentum of the Philippine campaign. This capability gap is what opened the door for something completely new: a dedicated night interceptor built around a modern radar system, with the endurance and firepower to dominate the hours when Japanese aircraft believed they were safest. When the U.S. Army Air Forces finally committed to building a true night fighter, the requirements they laid out were unlike anything in American aviation at the time. The aircraft had to patrol for long periods at night, operate independently of ground radar, carry a crew large enough to manage both flying and interception, and strike hard enough to bring down multi-engine bombers in a single pass. The established manufacturers, Lockheed, Grumman, Douglas, were already overwhelmed by wartime production. Their design teams were tied up delivering fighters and bombers needed urgently on every front. That opened the door for a younger, smaller company, the Northrop Aircraft Corporation. Northrop had only been in existence since 1939. It was known mostly for subcontracting work and experimental designs, not frontline combat aircraft. But this unfamiliar role became an advantage. Northrop wasn't constrained by old templates or by the need to adapt an existing airframe. They were free to design an entirely new aircraft around a single mission: winning the night. Their concept broke sharply from conventional fighter design. Instead of a single engine and compact fuselage, the new aircraft would use 2 powerful Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double Wasp engines, each producing 2,000 horsepower. The twin-boom layout provided stability, space for a crew of 3, and room for advanced radar equipment in the nose. The armament was equally ambitious. 4 20mm Hispano M2 cannons were placed under the fuselage for concentrated forward fire. A remotely operated dorsal turret with 450 caliber machine guns added flexibility, allowing the gunner to engage targets that maneuvered out of the pilot's line of fire. But the biggest change wasn't visible from the outside. Engineers integrated the SCR-720, a microwave radar developed in cooperation with MIT's radiation laboratory. This system offered far better range and clarity than earlier radars, and allowed the aircraft to perform nearly all stages of an intercept, detection, approach, and firing without ever seeing the target visually. The airframe supporting this technology was large by fighter standards, 50 feet in length, a wingspan of 66 feet, and a maximum takeoff weight over 29,000 pounds. Yet the unusual proportions were a direct response to the technical demands of night fighting. Space, endurance, and crew coordination mattered more at night than raw speed. Even the aircraft's appearance reflected its mission. During tests conducted by MIT, a glossy black finish proved the most effective color for evading searchlights. The paint absorbed and deflected light in ways that made the aircraft almost impossible to track visually from the ground. And once pilots began flying her, they realized the Black Widow wasn't just hard to see, she was remarkably safe to fly. Many newcomers admitted feeling a cold shiver the first time they pushed a P-61 into a moonless sky. Night flying had always been the most dangerous flying, but airborne, the Black Widow settled into a rhythm no other American night fighter could match. The long wings, powerful engines, and forgiving control surfaces made her stable in darkness, steady in turbulence, and predictable during radar-guided intercepts. That stability mattered. Early British night fighters forced adaptations of day aircraft, often struggled to hold formation, let alone maintain a clean radar approach. Their early radars were crude, their cockpits cluttered, and their pilots frequently lost tracks simply because the aircraft couldn't stay where the radar operator needed it. The P-61 changed that equation entirely. Her black silhouette vanished into the sky, but to the crew inside, she was solid and trustworthy. With the SCR-720 guiding every turn, the Black Widow could stalk a bomber, close to firing range, and destroy it without ever making visual contact. For many pilots, it was the first time night interception felt like a controlled kill, not a gamble. In the Black Widow, the darkness stopped being a threat. It became an advantage. By late 1943, the first prototypes were flying. The P-61 Black Widow, named after the venomous spider, had become the world's first dedicated American night fighter, purpose-built to hunt in conditions where previous aircraft had relied on luck, moonlight, or incomplete ground guidance. What set the P-61 apart from every American night fighter before it was the SCR-720 radar, a system that quietly redefined what nighttime air combat could look like. Earlier airborne radars had been experimental and fragile. They struggled with ground clutter, offered limited range, and often produced ambiguous returns that required ground controllers to talk fighters onto their targets. At night, over unfamiliar islands and broken coastlines, that method left pilots guessing far too often. The SCR-720 changed that. Developed jointly by MIT's radiation laboratory and British scientists working on microwave technology, the SCR-720 used a shorter wavelength that dramatically sharpened its accuracy. It could detect aircraft 5 to 10 miles away, display relative altitude, and guide the crew through an intercept, long before either side could see anything outside the cockpit. The heart of the system was a 30-inch helical scan antenna housed beneath a streamlined fiberglass radome in the nose. This rotating dish swept a focused beam across the sky, building a clear picture on the radar operator's scope. Instead of broad, uncertain arcs, the operator saw distinct blips with enough precision to give the pilot exact corrections, left or right, above or below, closing or diverging. Just as important, the radar featured identification friend, or foe capability, reducing the risk of engaging American aircraft in the confusion of night operations. Together, these advancements allowed the P-61 crew to function as a self-contained interception team. The radar operator handled detection and tracking, while the pilot maneuvered into firing position. Once the target entered the pilot's own simplified scope, the engagement could be completed without verbal guidance. For Japanese bomber crews, this technology created a blind spot they never accounted for. They flew at night specifically because they expected to be invisible. Their aircraft lacked tail-warning radars, and their doctrine relied on darkness as their primary defense. Against the SCR-720, that assumption collapsed. The Black Widow did not announce its presence with searchlights or tracer fire. It did not need moonlight or visual cues. It approached silently, guided by electronic eyes that worked regardless of weather, cloud cover, or terrain. In practical terms, the radar turned night into an environment where the advantage shifted decisively to the United States. The P-61 could patrol for hours, pick out individual aircraft from miles away, and attack with precision. Japan had no countermeasure, no detection system, and no change in tactics that could undo the radar's influence. It was this silent weapon, not speed, not maneuverability, that enabled the P-61 to dominate the night skies in 1944 and 1945. And it was this same radar that Major Carroll Smith would rely on when he climbed into his aircraft on the night of December 29th, preparing to intercept a formation of bombers Japan believed could not be stopped. While the P-61 represented a major leap in nighttime interception, its impact would mean little unless it could be brought to the front where the need was most urgent. Nowhere was that need clearer than on Mindoro Island, a small but crucial link in the American drive toward Luzon. In December 1944, Mindoro was less a finished base and more a construction zone. Engineers were carving 2 new airstrips out of coral and jungle, working under tight deadlines to ensure American fighters could support the upcoming assault at Lingayen Gulf. Until those runways were operational, the entire invasion force would rely on limited, distant air cover. Japanese commanders recognized this vulnerability. Their daylight options were gone, but nighttime gave them room to maneuver. Bombers could approach at low altitude, slip past radar gaps, and force construction teams to halt work. Even minor damage, craters, shattered equipment, fuel fires, could push the American schedule back days or weeks. The scale of the problem became clear almost immediately. For 14 consecutive days, Mindoro endured persistent night raids. Some nights brought a single bomber, others brought full formations. Alarms sounded so frequently that sleeping through the night became rare. Searchlights swept empty skies, anti-aircraft guns fired at shadows, and repair crews raced to fill craters before the next alarm sounded. The threat was not theoretical. Every hour of delay increased the risk to the 20,000 American troops preparing for the landing. Without fully functional airfields at Mindoro, fighter cover over the invasion beaches would be limited, leaving transport ships, landing craft, and ground forces dangerously exposed. By December 26th, the situation demanded a decisive response. That day, the 418th Night Fighter Squadron arrived on the island with a small detachment of P-61 Black Widows. It was the first time Mindoro had a dedicated night interception capability. The squadron barely had time to settle in before new clusters of Japanese aircraft began registering on radar. 3 nights later, those signals returned, stronger than before. Multiple bombers were approaching from the north, lining up for another strike on the unfinished airfields. This time, the Americans had an aircraft built for the darkness, and Major Carroll C. Smith was about to put it to the test. When the 418th Night Fighter Squadron deployed to Mindoro Island, one of the pilots assigned to lead its early operations was Major Carroll C. Smith. At 26, Smith was young by combat standards, but he was no novice. He had already flown more than 40 missions across the Pacific and had earned a reputation for being steady under pressure, a quality that mattered more in night fighting than almost any other skill. Night operations required a temperament different from daytime combat. There was no horizon to stabilize the senses, no sunlight to identify shapes, no visual reference to separate cloud layers from ocean surface. The men who excelled in this environment tended to be methodical and unflappable, able to process information from instruments and from their radar operator without distraction or panic. Smith fit that profile well. He was disciplined, calm, and precise, a pilot who rarely raised his voice, but who always seemed to know what needed to be done. Those who flew with him later said his greatest strength was his ability to stay focused during long periods of uncertainty, waiting for a radar contact to firm up or for a target to drop into range. Just as important was the man seated behind him, Lieutenant Philip Porter, his radar operator. Porter had spent months mastering the SCR-720 system, an instrument that required both technical understanding and quick judgment. He and Smith had practiced countless intercept drills together, approach angles, altitude corrections, timing of turns, until their communication became second nature. Their partnership reflected how the P-61 was meant to be flown, as a coordinated team where each crew member's decisions shaped the others. By the night of December 29th, both men understood the stakes. Radar reports suggested multiple inbound bombers heading toward Mindoro. Engineer crews were still working under blackout conditions, relying entirely on the 418th to keep the airfield safe. Based on fuel load, weather, and the number of aircraft approaching, Smith also knew the odds were not in his favor. One P-61 could not be everywhere at once. Major Smith and Lieutenant Porter were already in the cockpit of their P-61 when the call came. The aircraft had been fueled to capacity, but Smith knew the limitations well. Even with full tanks, the Black Widow could not pursue targets indefinitely. When Smith lifted off at 2340, he already knew the numbers didn't add up. 1 P-61 versus 12 bombers. The math was brutal. Even perfect flying only allowed time for 2, maybe 3 clean intercepts. Anything less than 4 meant Japanese bombs reaching the runways, killing engineers, halting construction, and delaying the Lingayen Gulf invasion by weeks. Porter locked onto the first contact within minutes. A G-4M Betty at 8,000 feet. The bomber crew appeared unaware of the approaching P-61. Through the darkness, Smith relied entirely on the radar display until the aircraft came within a few hundred yards. Only then did faint outlines emerge, engine glow, a wing shape, the suggestion of a fuselage. Smith fired a brief, controlled burst. The 20mm rounds struck the Betty's right wing, igniting its unprotected fuel tanks. The bomber entered a shallow roll and disappeared into the clouds below. The time was 23:57. Porter immediately shifted focus to another contact farther south. This second Betty was lower, flying at 6,000 feet and closing steadily on the island. To reach it, Smith pushed the P-61 faster than he preferred, aware that each increase in power consumption cut into his remaining patrol time. The intercept unfolded smoothly, and the second bomber was destroyed within minutes of the first. 2 bombers down, both prevented from reaching the airfields, but Smith's fuel reserves had already dipped lower than he would have liked. The third contact proved more challenging. This aircraft maneuvered frequently, altering heading and altitude in ways the Betty crews usually did not. Porter eventually identified it as a Nakajima Ki-49 Helen, a heavier bomber with stronger defensive armament. As Smith closed in, the Helen's tail gunner opened fire, one of the few moments of resistance the Americans encountered that night. Smith adjusted his approach, attacking from a blind spot beneath the bomber. A longer burst brought down the Helen at 0029, but the engagement had required additional fuel and more aggressive maneuvering. The P-61 was now operating below the comfortable safety margin for extended patrols. Another contact appeared, this one lower and closer to Mindoro than the others. The aircraft was on a direct line toward the construction zone, only minutes from reaching its target. Smith descended rapidly to intercept. The bomber, another Betty, was flying a straight course without evasive action. A single well-timed burst separated the port wing from the fuselage, sending the aircraft into the water at 0:35. 4 bombers had been eliminated in less than an hour. But the night was not yet over. As Smith turned south toward Mindoro, Porter detected an additional return, smaller, faster, and unlike the previous tracks. This was not a bomber but a Nakajima Ki-84 Frank, one of Japan's most capable single-engine fighters. Although faster and more agile than the P-61, the Frank was effectively blind in the darkness. Porter guided Smith into position beneath and behind the fighter, enabling a clean engagement. The Frank went down at 0:46. By now, fuel was becoming critical. Smith calculated that he had little more than 20 minutes of flight time left, barely enough to reach the airfield under ideal conditions. He set a direct course for Mindoro, relying on radar altimeter readings to descend through cloud layers as the runway came into view. As he approached pattern altitude, the airfield experienced a sudden blackout. The lamps marking the runway went dark without warning. With no visual cues, Smith had to rely on instruments alone, descending carefully until the radar altimeter showed near-ground readings. The P-61 touched down harder than usual, but remained intact, rolling to a stop with only a few gallons of fuel remaining. The mission had lasted just over an hour. In that time, Major Smith and Lieutenant Porter destroyed 4 bombers and a fighter, preventing any Japanese aircraft from reaching Mindoro and allowing construction crews to work uninterrupted through the night. It was the kind of engagement the P-61 had been designed for, a combination of radar-guided precision, teamwork, and methodical execution that reshaped the balance of night operations in the Pacific. By the time Smith rolled to a stop on the Coral Runway, the outcome was already reshaping the next phase of the Pacific campaign. Not a single Japanese bomber had reached Mindoro that night. For the first time in 2 weeks, the engineers working on the airfields didn't have to dive into trenches or halt construction. They simply kept working, uninterrupted, through the darkness. And that mattered far more than the number of aircraft Smith had destroyed. The airfields on Mindoro were racing against the calendar. If the runways were delayed even a few days, the entire Lingayen Gulf operation would feel the impact. Transports waiting offshore longer, invasion forces exposed without fighter cover, and ground troops landing with far less protection overhead. A 2-week delay would have changed the shape of the whole campaign. Instead, construction stayed perfectly on schedule. 10 days later, when American troops hit the beaches at Lingayen on January 9, 1945, P-51s and P-47s from Mindoro were already in the air, exactly as planned, providing the umbrella of fighter cover the operation needed to succeed. The events over Mindoro Island didn't turn the P-61 into a legend because of how dramatic they looked. The truth is, no one on the ground even saw the fight. What mattered was what they didn't see. No explosions on the runways, no engineers scrambling for cover, no airfields burning in the dark. And that was the point. The Black Widow's strength wasn't in the size of its cannons, the horsepower of its engines, or the shape of its twin booms. Its true power came from something the enemy never heard, never detected, and never understood until it was too late. The SCR-720 microwave radar. That quiet upgrade, buried under fiberglass in the nose, transformed night combat. It let American pilots make interceptions in conditions where no human eyesight could help. It turned darkness from a defensive shield into a battlefield Americans could dominate. And it allowed a single night fighter to take apart an entire bombing raid before the first searchlight ever switched on. The P-61 didn't win the war alone, but it closed the final gap the U.S. had struggled with since the start of the Pacific Campaign: control of the night sky. And as for Major Carroll C. Smith, he never wrote a memoir or sought credit for what happened over Mindoro. But the record speaks for itself. 7 confirmed victories in less than 24 hours. 4 bombers in under 40 minutes. A blind landing with empty tanks. A mission that kept thousands of Americans alive. Today, only a handful of P-61s survive in museums. Their paint is faded, their radomes sealed, their engines silent. But the idea they introduced, that technology, when used with discipline and skill, can reverse the logic of a battlefield, remains as clear now as it was that night. The Black Widow didn't roar for attention, it hunted in silence. And with one radar dish and one crew who knew how to use it, it became the deadliest night killer of World War II. What happened in that 1 hour over Mindoro wasn't just a string of kills. It was the moment Japan lost its last dependable window to slow the American advance. Their night bombing strategy had relied on the assumption that darkness protected them. The SCR-720 proved otherwise. The P-61 had turned the night, their final refuge, into hostile territory. And after December 29th, Japanese crews knew it. The Black Widow didn't just defend an island. It kept a campaign moving, protected an invasion force, and closed the final gap in America's control of the Philippine skies.